Julian Hart wasn't the kind of man people fell in love with easily. He was a brilliant architect, known for flawless designs and structures where every line had a purpose. At 37, he lived alone in a sleek, modern mansion he'd designed himself, perched on a quiet hill just north of Seattle, where the city lights shimmered in the distance like stars he couldn't quite touch. No one had ever seen Julian fall in love, or even laugh freely. To the world, he was a cold genius. To those who'd worked with him, he was the man who rejected all forms of chaos, even emotional ones. 15 miles away, Marissa Lane wiped flour from her hands and tears from her face using the same faded apron. Her rented apartment was damp, her kitchen cramped, and the constant rumble of passing trains rattled the cabinets. Once a bakery owner, she'd lost everything during the pandemic. Now she worked any gig she could find, food delivery, virtual cooking classes, small-time catering jobs, just to care for her 5-year-old son, Eli, who had sensory processing disorder. That morning, a job alert flickered across the cracked screen of her phone. Private chef needed, immediate start, $4,500 0 cents/week, no degree required, requirement, silence. She glanced at Eli, who was lining up his toy trains with surgical precision, and heard her own stomach growl. $4,500. In 1 week. She didn't know she was about to step into the life of a man who had forgotten how to feel. And she never imagined that a single pancake, made with care instead of perfection, would change everything. $4,500 a week. A miracle, sudden and surreal, or maybe a trap, she couldn't tell. But one thing was certain, rent was due, the bills were stacking up, and Eli was still waiting for his name to rise on the therapy list. So she replied. 3 days later, Marissa stood in front of the towering steel gate at 1847 Maple Ridge Drive, with her son's tiny hand in hers. Eli clung close, his faded yellow SpongeBob backpack slumped on his small shoulders, worn from years of use. The morning air bit at her skin, and the coffee she downed on an empty stomach churned in her gut. She took a breath, then pressed the intercom button. "Enter." The male voice crackled through, emotionless. The gate opened without a sound, as if engineered to avoid disruption. Marissa led Eli through the stone path into a house that seemed to have been designed to devour noise. Towering ceilings, arched glass windows from floor to roof, and museum-white light filled the space. Their footsteps echoed, and Eli instinctively pressed into her leg. "Miss Lane?" She turned and lost all breath. Julian Hart stood at the top of a spiral staircase, like a figure carved from stillness. Tall, sharp-angled, hair neatly styled, wearing a charcoal suit that looked ironed by lasers. Each step he took downward felt intentional, designed. No handshake, no smile, just a nod. Work hours are 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. No phone calls, no music, no unnecessary conversation during food preparation and service. Marissa nodded. "I understand." His gray eyes narrowed. "You think you do. But most people believe they understand silence until they're forced to live inside it." His words were cold as metal. But when his gaze shifted to Eli, now gently rocking in place, eyes fixed on the floor, there was something else there. Not irritation, curiosity. Julian turned, leading them down a pristine marble hallway. Eli suddenly paused, knelt to the floor, and gently traced the veining with a finger. "Eli," Marissa whispered, "please, don't." "Let him," Julian said, glancing back. "It's Carrara marble. The veining follows a mathematical sequence." Eli looked up, wide-eyed. "It's beautiful." For the first time since they'd arrived, Julian's posture eased. Barely, but it was there. "Yes," he said softly. "It is." Marissa studied the man in front of her. Flawless, distant, and quietly lonely. She didn't know yet that one pancake would soon become the only thing powerful enough to disrupt a life designed entirely around silence and control. Marissa arrived at the mansion at 5:45 a.m. Her hands trembled, not from the morning chill, but from the 3 cups of instant coffee she downed after a nearly sleepless night. Eli had had a rough night, bad dreams about a house too quiet, too large, and a marble man who suddenly wasn't kind anymore. She'd spent nearly an hour at his bedside, whispering, "He's not mean, baby. He's just not used to people yet." The kitchen looked different in the morning light. Less like a laboratory, more like a chapel, waiting to be filled with the scent of butter and hope. She tied back her hair, washed her hands, and began to cook pancakes. Eli's favorite. But today, they weren't just for Eli. Last night, as she'd tucked him into bed, he'd asked, "Do you think he likes pancakes, Mommy?" She'd thought of Julian's response, delivered almost like a confession. "I don't know. I've never had pancakes made with love. Not, I don't like sweets. Not, I've had better. But I've never tasted love before." The words had stayed with her all night, sharp and soft at once. And so she mixed the batter by hand, slow, careful, like her grandmother taught her. No machines, no rush, just intention. Love, Grandma said, wasn't something you sprinted through. It was folded in, patiently. Footsteps approached behind her. She startled, batter splashing onto the marble counter. "You're early," came Julian's voice, steady but not cold. He stood at the kitchen doorway in a dark suit, tie already knotted. But his hair was slightly mussed, and the faint shadows beneath his eyes hadn't been erased. "I wanted to get familiar with the kitchen," she said, wiping the counter. "Didn't sleep much." He nodded and moved to the coffee machine, measuring the grounds with the same precision he likely used in blueprints. "Ellie's not with you today." His question surprised her. She'd expected indifference, maybe even relief. "No, my neighbor's watching him. She used to work in special education." Julian nodded, and though he didn't speak again, she felt it. He was listening. "He really wanted to come. He keeps talking about the floor patterns, about you." Julian stared into his coffee. "I don't usually talk to children." "I figured," she smiled. "But Eli," he paused, "he's different. He sees what adults forget to look for," she said quietly. "He doesn't just look, he feels." Silence again, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt honest. "I didn't mention something yesterday," Julian said, like someone pushing himself past discomfort, "about my diet." "Yes. I don't like surprises, flavors that shift, textures that change. Everything needs to be predictable." She flipped the pancake gently. "You like control." "I need it, not want, need." She plated the pancake, added a pat of melting butter and just a drizzle of syrup. "And comfort?" she asked. "Do you like food that makes you feel safe?" He didn't answer for a long time. "I don't remember the last time food made me feel anything." She placed the plate in front of him and pulled out a chair. "Try it," she said. "It's not perfect, but it's real and made with love." He sat slowly, picked up the fork, like it might hurt him, took a bite. Silence, then softly, "It's warm, because it's fresh off the stove." "No, not that kind of warm," he said. "It tastes like someone thought about me when they made it." Marissa didn't speak. She couldn't, because for the first time, Julian Hart, the man made of marble and silence, had let himself feel something. And it had started with a pancake. Day 3 on the job. Marissa was slicing fruit when she glanced toward the foyer, where Eli sat cross-legged on the marble floor, head tilted, eyes fixed on the veining like he was observing something sacred. His small fingers moved slowly, tracing each swirl as if mapping out a secret world only he could see. Julian stood in the doorway, one hand resting lightly against the wooden frame, suspended in that space between approaching and retreating. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt, just watched. And Marissa noticed this was the second morning in a row he'd done that. It surprised her. Not because Julian disliked Eli, no, that wasn't it, but because this was the same man who had listed silence as a condition of employment. A man who, she assumed, lived in straight lines and rigid order. And yet, here he was, quietly observing a child read stories from stone. "These lines are like rivers," Eli murmured. "But rivers that forgot how to move. Julian's mouth tightened, as though something in him resisted understanding, and yet he stepped forward, slowly, gently, like he didn't want to break the moment. "Elise," Marissa called softly, "come wash your hands, honey." But instead of obeying right away, Eli looked up at Julian with unexpected seriousness. "Mr. Julian, do you want to see how the lines connect? They tell a story." Marissa froze. In Eli's world, that kind of invitation wasn't casual. It was sacred, a quiet offering of trust, the kind he only extended to those who made him feel completely safe. And Julian, without hesitation, knelt, right there on the marble. In his tailored dark suit, no pause, no correction, just presence. "Look," Eli pointed, "it starts here, then breaks here. That's the sad part. But then it comes back around, and it's even prettier, because it learned how to go around the sad part." Julian stared at the veining like it had never been there before, or perhaps like he was seeing it for the very first time. "You think marble tells stories?" he asked, quietly. "I think everything tells stories, especially people." Eli turned his head slightly. "Your story is in your eyes. It's a little broken, but it's trying to fix itself." Marissa went still at the counter. The wooden spoon nearly slipped from her hand. Julian didn't move. Only his eyes flickered, like something had cracked, gently, within him. "Eli," she said, cautious, "maybe let's not—" "It's okay." Julian's voice was low, softer than she'd ever heard it. "He's not wrong." A few minutes later, they ate breakfast together. For the first time, the three of them. Eli chattered about his friend Marcus, who collected bottle caps, and the pigeon named Gerald on their window ledge. Julian listened, really listened, and asked follow-up questions that proved he was paying attention. "Do you have friends?" Eli asked, syrup smudged across his cheek. Julian hesitated. "I have colleagues." "That's not the same. Friends are people who like your broken parts too." Julian set his fork down. His hand trembled slightly. Melissa said nothing. She didn't need to, because she could see it, clear, slow, and undeniable, the change. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud, but it was real. A man who'd built his life on control was learning how to make space for feeling, and it had all begun with a little boy, sticky with syrup, who could see emotion written in stone. If Marissa ever started believing in change, it wouldn't be because of grand gestures, but because of the tiny things no one else would even notice. But she noticed Julian began showing up in the kitchen a little earlier each morning. Not by much, 5 or 7 minutes at most, just enough to catch Eli stacking spoons or Marissa reaching for the kettle. He never said good morning, but he nodded, slowly, steadily, and strangely, his eyes no longer avoided contact. At first, he kept his distance, leaned against the doorway, hands in pockets, like his presence was incidental. But one morning, he pulled out a chair and simply sat at the table while Marissa flipped pancakes. No request, no announcement, he just stayed. Once, Marissa dropped a kitchen towel. As she bent to retrieve it, Julian had already reached down, handing it back without a word. No judgment in his glance, just something quietly human. She thought she was imagining it, but then it kept happening. Julian noticed that Eli preferred the orange cup. The next morning, Julian took that cup from the shelf before anyone else did. He also switched from using a metal knife to a wooden spoon for honey, because Eli had once flinched at the scraping sound. These weren't habits, they were choices. And those choices told Marissa one thing. Julian was learning to see, not with the eyes of an architect chasing symmetry, but with the heart of someone seeking connection. She saw it most clearly on day 10. Eli placed a smooth gray stone in the hallway. Nothing fancy, just something he called the peace rock. Before, Julian might have ignored it or moved it aside. This time, he paused, bent down, studied it, then slipped it into his suit pocket without a word. Marissa nearly teared up. Another morning, while she was making omelets, Julian suddenly asked, "Have you ever taught anyone to cook?" She blinked. "I used to teach online classes." He nodded, hesitated, then, "Could you teach me?" She turned to look at him, hands loosely by his sides, as if afraid to want too much. "Of course," she smiled, handing him an egg and a whisk, "but no judging when the yolk escapes." Julian took them carefully, like he was holding something far more fragile than eggs. His first few motions were clumsy, too hard, then too soft. But he tried. And he listened. "Don't whisk like it's a spreadsheet," she teased. "Eggs don't need control. They need rhythm." Julian chuckled. Not a big laugh. Not loud. But real. The first genuine sound she'd heard from him that wasn't wrapped in armor. "It's strange," he said. "I spent my life believing I had to hold on tight to keep things from falling apart. And now?" He looked down at the golden swirl of yolk in the bowl. "Now I'm starting to think, maybe you hold on to things best when you let them breathe." The next morning, Eli asked a simple, brave question. "Do you like me?" Julian paused. His eyes widened just slightly, like he'd been caught doing something he wasn't supposed to feel. Before Marissa could jump in, he knelt, eye level with Eli. "I think I'm learning how to. And I think I'm learning from you." Eli nodded like it was the most natural thing in the world, but for Marissa, it was everything. Because for the first time, Julian wasn't trying to understand emotions through logic. He was simply letting them exist. And that, she knew, was where real trust began. That morning smelled of pancakes and coffee. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. But beneath the surface was something brittle. Something waiting to crack. Marissa opened the drawer under the kitchen counter, looking for a small pair of scissors she'd used before. She remembered using them on Eli's shirt collar 2 mornings ago, but instead of scissors, her hand brushed something hard, sharp edges, a folder. Her name stared back at her. Marissa Lane. Her pulse spiked instantly. She opened the file. She didn't mean to, but she couldn't stop herself. Inside were pages, dozens of them. Ellie's birth certificate, medical records, lease history, bank statements, an old school report that brought back the sting of a memory, begging a preschool to let her son stay just 1 more term, and at the center, 1 page with a diagnosis she'd read 1,000 times and still wasn't numb to: autism spectrum disorder, level 2. Her hands trembled, not from shame, but from betrayal. Behind her, Julian's voice broke the air. "Were you looking for something?" She turned around, holding the folder. Her voice was low and sharp. "Can you explain why I'm in your files?" Julian looked at her, calm but caught. "I needed to be sure. You and Eli are living in my home. I had to know who I was trusting." She almost laughed, a jagged, broken kind of laugh. "You didn't trust me, Julian. You researched me, like I'm a risk, a threat." "Marissa, please, try to see." "No," she cut in, "I see it perfectly. You don't trust people. You gather data. You reduce them to variables." Julian looked down, jaw tightening. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "That's exactly the problem. You didn't even think this would hurt me." She gestured toward the folder. "This isn't just paper. These are the hardest parts of my life. The nights I cried because I didn't know if I could afford Eli's therapy. The eviction notices. The guilt of not being enough. You saw them, and you still looked at me like I was a case study." Eli peeked up from the table. "Mom?" She softened for him, kneeling down. "Grab your coat, baby, we're leaving." Julian stepped forward. "Please, just listen." "No," she said again, firmer this time. "I have been judged enough. By teachers, by landlords, by people who thought poverty was a personal failing. I didn't think you would be one of them." Julian's face fell. For the first time since she met him, he looked lost. "I was trying to protect myself." "From what?" she asked. "From kindness? From the possibility that we might just be human, messy, flawed, but worthy of trust?" Eli returned, coat in hand. "Are we going far?" "We're going somewhere I don't have to prove I belong." She opened the door. Julian didn't stop her, because he couldn't. Alone in the kitchen, Julian sat at the table. The file lay open in front of him. One line on the last page caught his eye. The child draws as if the world is too loud, and the pencil is the only place he can speak. He thought of Eli's hand in his that day, small, still, and for the first time, Julian realized maybe he was the one who had never learned how to speak. Julian always thought he understood himself. He knew he wasn't good at conversation, knew he didn't like being touched, knew chaos made him anxious, from late dinners to screaming children in grocery stores. He accepted these traits as part of his design, clean, controlled, precise. But after Marissa and Eli left, the control collapsed. The house was too quiet, too clean. No more Eli's random humming, no more Marissa folding napkins in the soft morning light. Just him, surrounded by absence. The first night, he didn't sleep. The second, he worked until 3 a.m. but couldn't finish a single drawing. The third, he tried scotch. It made him nauseous. By the fourth, he opened the file Marissa left behind. He read every page. This time, not to know, but to see. A mother trying to survive, a boy who didn't need fixing, only understanding. And himself, reflected in the cold distance he thought was protection. He remembered his own mother, a nurse with military precision. Dinner at 6, no hugs, no I love you. His father, always gone, or worse, angry, distant, drinking. Julian learned early, the less you let people see, the less they can hurt you. So he built a life of measurements and math, things that didn't leave. Until Marissa and Ellie. That week, he called the therapy office Unts. He dismissed therapy as indulgent. I don't need someone looking into my head, he'd said now. He needed to look into it himself. The office wasn't what he imagined. Soft light, no judgment. A therapist who listened. Why are you here? She asked. I lost something I didn't realize mattered until it was gone. Who? A child named Eli. And his mother. And why did you lose them? Because I broke trust. I collected data instead of building connection. What were you afraid of? He hesitated. Then, of not being enough, if I didn't control everything, of being left, again, even he didn't expect those words. But saying them out loud cracked something, not to break, but to let in light. That night, Julian wrote a letter, not to explain, not to beg, but to be real for the first time in his life. Marissa, I used to think knowing everything about someone kept me safe. I was wrong. I broke the only thing that doesn't need explaining. Trust. No apology can undo that. But silence would be worse. Eli taught me that some feelings aren't meant to be understood, just heard. You taught me that kindness doesn't demand proof. It simply stays. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want you to know that since the moment you left, I haven't lived the same. I'm learning, slowly, to stop hurting others through my own fear. And if someday Eli ever wants to draw here again, the table is still waiting, Julian. He folded the letter, didn't send it, but left it next to the little stone Eli once called his peace rock. That night, for the first time in years, Julian slept. Not because he'd been forgiven, but because he'd begun to forgive himself. Not long after sending, the envelope was plain, no return address, but Marissa recognized the handwriting instantly. Neat, sharp, almost mechanical. Julian. She hesitated, fingers tight around the flap, her heart beat faster, not because she hoped for anything, but because she was afraid it might break through her resolve. She opened it, she read it, she folded the letter, then unfolded it again, read slowly, every line hitting something deeper than anger. No pleading, no excuses, no come back to me, just truth, vulnerability, change. For the first time, Marissa saw Julian not as a man trying to protect himself, but as someone who had finally let go of the armor. And the tears came. There was a part of Marissa that had always feared that forgiveness would make her weak, that trusting again would break her in the same old way. But Julian hadn't just broken her trust. He made her face how tightly she'd guarded her own soul. She saw him now, and in that she saw herself. Two people who learned to survive by shutting the world out, and now both were learning to let it in. She smiled through tears. Maybe, she thought, it's time to believe again. The next morning, Eli sat by the window, holding his sketch pad. "Mom?" he asked. "Do you think my red train is still there?" "Do you want to find out?" she asked. Eli nodded. "I think he kept it." "Why?" "Because if he didn't throw it away, it means he remembers me." Marissa blinked back a tear. Children didn't need eloquence, they simply felt. "Then let's go," she said. When Julian saw them through the gate, he froze. He was watering the garden, the can stopped mid-air. Eli ran up to him, no hesitation. "Mr. Julian," he shouted, "I have a very important question." Julian knelt. "What's your question?" "Did you keep my red train?" Julian smiled, for the first time in weeks. "I kept it in the studio, on the table, every single day." Eli nodded, satisfied. "I knew it. That means you remembered me." Then he hugged Julian, not a shy hug. Not awkward, just real. Julian closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, he felt home wasn't a place, it was a person. Melissa stood by, watching, silent. Julian walked toward her, slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For reading the letter." She looked at him. "I read it, and I believe it." He exhaled. "I'm not asking you to forget, and I don't need you to start over," she said gently. "We'll just continue, from where we paused." He nodded. This time, he didn't need to be perfect, just present. That afternoon, the sound of red toy train wheels rolled down the marble hallway, not loud, but enough. Julian sat on the floor, watching Eli play. Marissa poured tea behind him, and for once, he wasn't thinking. He was simply there, and he thought, maybe home isn't something we build. Maybe it's someone who opens the door when we're finally ready to knock. After that first hug, after the look that held not doubt but acceptance, nothing became perfect overnight. But they were no longer strangers either. They didn't restart. They simply continued from where they had paused. And through the smallest things, a slightly burnt pancake, a simple silver bracelet, they began to build something neither had dared to name before. A family. Julian had never made pancakes. He'd always thought of them as simple: flour, eggs, milk, a formula. But when Eli handed him a whisk and declared, "You're the chef today, I'm the helper," Julian felt his hands tremble just a little. "Mom says to mix it gently," Eli advised, "but not too much, or the batter gets sad." Julian laughed. "Batter gets sad?" Eli nodded, serious. "Like grown-ups. If you push too hard, they go quiet." Julian didn't reply. He just stirred slowly, unevenly, without trying to be perfect. That morning's pancakes were a little burnt at the edges, slightly lopsided. Eli ate them all, beaming. "These are the best ever," he said. And Julian knew he had just created something no blueprint could ever plan: a family ritual. That evening, as Marissa cleaned the spice shelf, Julian stepped into the kitchen, holding a small box. "I have something for you," he said. His voice wasn't shaky, but it was humble. Marissa opened the box. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with 3 tiny charms: a miniature whisk, a smooth gray marble, and a simple heart. She looked up, her eyes softening. Julian spoke quietly. "The whisk is for the first morning I tried to do something imperfect. The marble? For Eli, who left it everywhere as a quiet reminder of peace. And the heart? That's the part I'm still learning." He stepped closer. "I don't have a 5-year plan for this. I won't promise I'll always get it right. But I promise I'll keep learning to love the way you taught me." Marissa didn't answer right away. Her eyes shimmered, not with doubt, but with something deeper. Then, quietly, she held out her hand, and he fastened the bracelet gently to her wrist, like placing a quiet part of his heart into her keeping. The next morning, the sound of batter hitting the pan, Eli's laughter echoing, the smell of honey warming in the air. They didn't say it, but they all knew. They were already a family, not because it was perfect, but because they chose each other every day. 2 years later, Julian's office looked different now. Same old wooden desk, same soft sunlight from the east-facing window, but beside the architectural blueprint sat a box of crayons, a red train sketch scribbled across printer paper, and next to his computer mouse, a small gray marble, Eli's peace rock. Julian didn't mind. In fact, his desk had never felt more like a workspace, until it held traces of that little boy. Eli had turned 7 just a month ago. He still loved quiet drawing sessions and still asked impossible questions, but now he had a new favorite word: Dad. Dad Julian, he would say, grinning like he'd just won an imaginary quest. Julian remembered the first time Eli called him that. No warning, no testing the waters, just a single word, gentle, natural, and strong enough to stop his heart. The adoption papers were signed. Legally, adoptive father. But in his heart, Eli had always been his son. No modifiers needed. Marissa was in the kitchen making pancakes. She still used the old whisk, even though Julian had bought her a new one 10 times over. Life wasn't always perfect. There were tantrums, missed deadlines, quiet evenings after long days. But they'd learned how to listen, how to wait, how to love, in all their unfinished ways. Julian stood by his desk, eyes on Eli's half-finished drawing, a puzzle in progress, walls, a roof, and one door not yet sketched. He smiled. The future was still incomplete, but this time he wasn't building it alone.